ISO 27001 is an international standard for managing information security through a structured management system known as an ISMS. This video provides a practical overview of what an ISMS really is, why organizations choose to implement ISO 27001, and how the standard's clauses work together as a system, not as isolated compliance activities. The focus is on implementation in the real world, organizational dynamics, leadership involvement, and building momentum while maintaining governance. An information security management system is a set of policies, processes, roles, and controls that work together to protect information. It's not a technology solution, a checklist, or once-off project. An ISMS is a management system that integrates into how the organization operates, makes decisions, and manages risk. Organizations implement ISO 27001 assist them with the management of their information security risks, protection of critical services and data, ensuring that they meet customer, legal, and regulatory expectations, as well as demonstrate trust and assurance to stakeholders. This certification provides an independent confirmation that information security risks are being managed in a structured and repeatable way. ISO is structured into clauses that describe how the ISMS is established, implemented, operated, monitored, reviewed, and continually improved. These clauses work together as a life cycle, supported by a controls selected through risk assessment. This diagram shows the full life cycle of an information security management system, covering both implementation and ongoing maintenance. At the center is the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, which reinforces that an ISMS is not a once-off project, but a continually operating management system. The life cycle starts with context and scope definition. This is where the organization understands its internal and external environment, identifies interested parties, determines obligations, and defines the boundaries of the ISMS. These decisions shape everything that follows. From there, the life cycle moves into leadership and commitment. This step reflects Clause 5 of ISO IEC 27001, where leadership accepts accountability, sets direction, approves policy, and establishes governance. Without this commitment, the ISMS cannot function effectively. Once leadership direction is established, the organization performs risk assessment and risk treatment. Information security risks are identified, analyzed, and evaluated, and decisions are made on how those risks will be treated in line with business objectives and risk appetite. The next step is control implementation. This is where selected controls are implemented and embedded into business processes, systems, and ways of working, not as standalone security activities, but as part of normal operations. Following implementation, the ISMS moves into operation and monitoring. Controls are operated, performance is measured, incidents are managed, and evidence is collected to demonstrate that controls are working as intended. The life cycle then moves into review and continual improvement. Through internal audits, management reviews, and performance evaluation, the organization assesses whether the ISMS remains effective, relevant, and aligned with business needs. The outputs of review feed directly back into the next planning cycle. Changes in the organization, emerging risks, incidents, or audit findings drive updates to scope, risk assessments, controls, and objectives. This continuous loop ensures that the ISMS evolves with the organization, remains auditable, and continues to provide value, supporting governance, risk management, and business resilience over time. Implementing an ISMS is not just a technical exercise. One of the biggest challenges is navigating unfamiliar organizational dynamics and internal politics. When you step into a new organization, whether as a consultant, ISMS lead, or program owner, you're often working across teams with different priorities, pressures, and levels of understanding. Decisions about information security can surface existing tensions around ownership, accountability, and control. At the same time, the ISMS still needs to move forward. This means building trust while progressing the implementation, listening carefully, engaging stakeholders, and bringing people along rather than forcing compliance. Momentum matters, but so does credibility. Perhaps the hardest challenge is balancing speed with understanding. Move too fast and you risk resistance, poor ownership, or superficial compliance. Move too slowly and the ISMS loses momentum, executive confidence, and urgency. Finding that balance, progressing the ISMS while taking the time to understand the organization, is often the most difficult part of implementation. Successful ISMS delivery recognizes that people, culture, and governance are just as critical as controls and documentation. Clause 4. Context of the organization. Understanding organizational dynamics while building momentum. Clause 4 matters because it establishes the foundation on which the entire ISMS is built. First, Clause 4 establishes the business and risk foundation of the ISMS. It requires the organization to understand its context, its stakeholders, and its obligations before any controls are selected or implemented. Without this foundation, security decisions are disconnected from business reality. Second, Clause 4 ensures the ISMS is relevant, risk-based, and business-aligned. By understanding internal and external issues as well as interested party requirements, the ISMS is designed to address real risks, not theoretical ones. This alignment is critical for leadership support and long-term sustainability. Third, Clause 4 prevents generic and poorly scoped implementations. Many failed ISMS implementations start with templates or control lists, without understanding what actually matters to the organization. Clause 4 forces organizations to define scope and priorities properly, reducing unnecessary controls and audit issues later on. Finally, Clause 4 drives effective risk assessment and control selection. Context and scope decisions directly influence which risks are assessed and which controls are appropriate. When Clause 4 is done well, risk assessments are meaningful and control selection is defensible and auditable. In simple terms, Clause 4 ensures the ISMS is built on understanding, not assumptions, and that everything that follows is relevant, proportionate, and effective. Leadership involvement is essential because information security is ultimately a business decision, not a technical one. First, leadership involvement confirms strategic intent and business priorities. By engaging early, leadership ensures the ISMS is aligned to organizational objectives and supports what the business is trying to achieve, rather than operating in isolation. Second, leadership sets risk appetite and tolerance levels. Only leadership can determine how much risk the organization is willing to accept, which risks must be treated, and where trade-offs are acceptable. Without this input, risk assessments lack context and decision-making becomes inconsistent. Third, leadership involvement assigns accountability for information security outcomes. This ensures that risks, controls, and decisions are owned by the business, not pushed down solely to IT or security teams. Clear accountability is critical for effective governance and audit defensibility. Fourth, leadership provides governance and authority for scope decisions. Decisions about what is included in scope and what is not require authority, prioritization, and alignment with business reality. Leadership involvement ensures these decisions are deliberate, justified, and defensible. When leadership is engaged at Clause 4, the ISMS is owned, governed, and defensible. This early involvement creates a solid foundation for planning, risk management, and effective implementation in the clauses that follow. Clause 4 Process Overview. Understand the organization. Identify internal and external issues. Identify interested parties and their requirements. Define the ISMS scope and validate with leadership. feed outputs into risk assessment. Each step builds on the previous one. This slide links organizational dynamics directly to ISMS context, as required by Clause 4.1 and Clause 4.2. These clauses require the organization to understand itself, its environment, its culture, and the needs and expectations of interested parties before defining scope, risks, and controls. In an ISMS implementation, organizational context defines some very practical realities. It determines how decisions are made and escalated, whether authority is centralized, distributed, or informal. It highlights where influence and resistance exist, which teams drive change and which may push back. It clarifies what risks truly matter to the business beyond what appears on paper. And it sets expectations for how quickly change can realistically be adopted without disrupting operations. When this context is understood properly, the ISMS stops being theoretical. By understanding internal and external context, the ISMS begins to reflect real business priorities. Controls are aligned to how the organization actually operates, not how a template assumes it should operate. Stakeholders are more likely to engage and support the ISMS because it recognizes their realities. And progress can be maintained without creating unnecessary resistance or fatigue. This is why Clause 4 is so critical. It ensures the ISMS is built around people, structure, and decision-making, not just controls and documentation. When organizational dynamics are understood and respected, the ISMS becomes relevant, achievable, and sustainable. Step 1. Understand the organization. This step establishes what the organization does, how it delivers value, and which services and information assets are critical. It highlights key services and products, information dependencies, internal capabilities and constraints. This understanding shapes every later decision in the ISMS. Step 2 focuses on understanding the internal and external issues that influence the organization's ability to achieve its information security objectives. Clause 4.1 is about context, not controls. Internally, this includes factors such as governance structures, skills and competence, organizational culture, and technology maturity. These internal conditions shape how effectively information security can be implemented and sustained. Externally, the organization must consider legal and regulatory requirements, market and customer expectations, and the evolving cyber threat landscape. These external pressures often drive security priorities and influence risk exposure. The key point is focus. Clause 4.1 does not require a general business analysis. It requires focusing on factors that influence information security risk. The outcome of this step is a documented internal and external issues register. This register provides traceability between organizational context and later decisions about scope, risk assessment, control selection, and planning. By understanding these issues early, the ISMS is designed to reflect the organization's reality, rather than applying generic or misaligned controls. Clause 4 requires the organization to understand its context before designing the ISMS. This context includes what the organization does, how it delivers value, and which services and information are critical to business operations. By analyzing organizational context, the ISMS is shaped around what truly matters, identifying critical services and information assets that need protection. Context analysis also highlights internal capabilities and limitations, such as skills, resources, structure, and organizational maturity. This understanding ensures the ISMS is realistic, proportionate, and aligned to how the organization actually operates, rather than being based on generic assumptions. In practical terms, context sets the foundation for scope definition, risk assessment, and leadership decision-making. Step 3 focuses on interested parties as required by Clause 4.2. Once the organization understands its internal and external context, the next step is to identify who affects or is affected by information security. Interested parties are not limited to customers. They include any individual, group, or organization that has information security requirements, expectations, or influence over the ISMS. This includes identifying stakeholders that impact information security, as well as those impacted by security failures or weaknesses. From there, the organization determines the legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements associated with those interested parties. These requirements often come from laws, regulations, contracts, service agreements, or industry obligations, and they directly influence risk and control decisions. Typical examples of interested parties include customers, regulators, employees, and suppliers. Each of these groups has different expectations, levels of influence, and security requirements that must be understood and managed. The key output of this step is a documented interested parties and requirements register. This register provides traceability between stakeholder expectations and later decisions about scope, risk assessment, control selection, and compliance. Clause 4.2 ensures the ISMS is not designed in isolation, but reflects the organization's obligations, relationships, and accountability to those it depends on and those who depend on it. One of the most important outcomes of Clause 4 is understanding who the organization's interested parties are and why they matter to the ISMS. Interested parties include customers, regulators, employees, suppliers, shareholders, and strategic partners. Each of these groups places different expectations on how information is protected. These expectations are not theoretical. They directly influence the design of the ISMS by helping determine legal, regulatory, and contractual obligations, as well as customer and stakeholder expectations around confidentiality, availability, and integrity of information. In other words, interested parties help define what the organization must protect, why it must protect it, and what level of assurance is required. The outputs from understanding organizational context and interested parties have a direct and practical impact on how the ISMS is designed. Firstly, they define the ISMS scope, determining which services, locations, systems, and information assets fall within the boundaries of the management system. Secondly, they drive security priorities. Critical services, regulatory obligations, and customer expectations determine where protection efforts must be focused, rather than applying controls evenly or generically. Finally, they influence risk acceptance decisions. Leadership must decide which risks are acceptable based on business objectives, legal requirements, and stakeholder expectations. This is why Clause 4 connects so strongly to Clauses 5 and 6. Context and interested party requirements inform leadership direction, risk appetite, and the selection of appropriate controls. When these inputs are clearly understood, the ISMS is designed to support the business, not constrain it. Step 4 focuses on defining the scope of the ISMS, as required by Clause 4.3. The scope sets the formal boundaries of the ISMS and determines what is included, what is excluded, and how information flows across those boundaries. It is one of the most important decisions in an ISO 27001 implementation, and one of the most scrutinized during audit. The first step is to define the boundaries of the ISMS based on context and risk. This means using the internal and external issues identified in Clause 4.1 and the interested party requirements identified in Clause 4.2 to determine where information security controls are actually needed. Next, the scope must include services, locations, systems, and third parties that are relevant to information security. This ensures the ISMS reflects how the organization delivers services and manages information in practice, not just how it is structured on paper. The scope must then clearly state exclusions and interfaces. Where activities, systems, or services are excluded, the reasons must be justified and defensible. Interfaces with out-of-scope areas or external providers must also be clearly described, so risks are not hidden or misunderstood. The output of this step is an approved ISMS scope statement. This statement provides clarity for stakeholders, direction for risk assessment and control selection, and a clear basis for audit and certification. A well-defined scope ensures the ISMS is focused, relevant, and defensible and prevents ambiguity later in implementation, operation, and audit. At this point, the ISMS moves from analysis and definition into formal leadership ownership. This step ensures that context, scope, and direction are not just documented but understood, agreed, and approved at the right level. First, leadership reviews the organizational context and the proposed ISMS scope. This review confirms that the ISMS reflects how the organization actually operates and that no critical risks, obligations, or dependencies have been overlooked. Next, leadership confirms business priorities and risk appetite. This is where management explicitly agrees which risks will be treated, which may be accepted, and how information security supports business objectives. Without this confirmation, risk decisions lack authority. Leadership then ensures accountability and governance are in place. This includes confirming roles, responsibilities, escalation paths, and decision-making structures, so that the ISMS can be directed and sustained over time. The output of this step is management approval evidence. This may include signed scope statements, meeting minutes, approvals, or formal decisions that demonstrate leadership ownership. Leadership validation is a crucial step. It makes the ISMS owned, governed, and defensible and provides the foundation for effective planning, risk treatment, and implementation in the clauses that follow. Step 6 shows how the outputs from Clause 4 become direct inputs into risk assessment, as required by Clause 6. Context is not something that is documented and then forgotten. It must actively shape how risks are identified, assessed, and treated. First, the organization uses its context and scope to identify relevant assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. Because the ISMS context is already defined, risk identification is focused on what actually matters, not on generic or hypothetical risks. Second, this ensures that identified risks reflect real business exposure. Risks are linked to actual services, systems, locations, people, and third parties within scope, rather than being copied from a template or checklist. Third, this understanding supports proportionate control selection, including the selection of Annex A controls. Controls are chosen based on risk and business context, not because they exist in a list. This makes control selection defensible, practical, and auditable. Finally, there is a clear expectation that context must be used, not just documented. Auditors expect to see traceability between organizational context, risk assessment outcomes, and control decisions. When context drives risk assessment, the ISMS becomes coherent. Risks make sense, controls are justified, and the system operates as an integrated whole, rather than a collection of disconnected documents. When auditors review Clause 4, they are looking to confirm that the organization has properly defined the context of the ISMS and that this context is meaningful, not just documented. First, auditors expect to see that internal and external issues relevant to information security have been identified and documented, as required by Clause 4.1. These issues should clearly relate to information security risk and the organization's ability to achieve its ISMS objectives. Second, auditors will look for evidence that interested parties and their information security requirements are understood and considered, in line with Clause 4.2. This includes understanding legal, regulatory, contractual, and stakeholder expectations that influence the ISMS. Third, auditors expect the ISMS scope to be clearly defined, justified, and aligned to organizational context and risk, as required by Clause 4.3. They will assess whether the scope boundaries make sense and whether any exclusions are deliberate and defensible. Common pitfalls to avoid. Treating Clause 4 as a paperwork exercise, defining scope too broadly or too narrowly, missing key interested party, skipping leadership validation. These issues weaken the entire ISMS. Clause 4 is the governance entry point to the ISMS. It defines the requirements that shape system design, accountability, risk decisions, long-term assurance. Get Clause 4 right and the rest of the ISMS becomes far more effective and sustainable.